I am really disappointed at the response of government. You know, we had a foot and mouth disease in, I think it was 2001. Everybody came together, all the bodies, statutory bodies, voluntary bodies, they all came together. They devised a plan. There was meetings every week and everybody was asked, how are you doing with this plan? And we were able to solve the foot and mouth disease because everybody was working together. That's not happening with homelessness.
Is it because homeless people don't vote? Is it because they're not seen as a priority?
You'd have to ask them that. I think people have negative attitudes towards homeless people, including decision makers. They share the perception that homeless people are drug users and mental health and their problems. And I think the local authorities share that very often, so they don't want to be housing homeless people. They think this is going to be trouble. In Finland, they've solved homelessness in Finland.
How have they done that?
Did it by, first of all, they just decided many people are homeless and they built enough apartments to house them. So they closed the hostels overnight and they put people into apartments. But there were two other factors. One, the person who made the decisions stayed in the job for a long time, built up an expertise and a passion for solving the problem. Here, the Minister for Housing is responsible, but he's in the job for maybe 3-4 years. Then there's a reshuffle, there's an election, he's out, somebody else comes in. He has to take 6-9 months to learn the job and knows that he's not going to be there forever. The other thing that they did in Finland was all the agencies worked together. They all came together to make sure that nobody falls between the cracks. Here, you can't get them to work together. It's almost impossible.
Father Peter McVerry, you are very welcome to the Lower Down Experience.
Thank you very much.
It is a pleasure to have you. I wanted to get you on to talk about the housing crisis, basically, and your work within that and what it's like at the minute and where you see it going. So, not much.
Okay.
How long do we have? So, tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing at the minute.
Well, as you say, we work with homeless people. We've been doing that. I opened my first hostel in 1979. And then we set ourselves up as an organisation in 1983. So we are calling this our 40th anniversary. We provide accommodation primarily for homeless people. We have about 25 hostels all over Dublin, a few in Kildare. We've almost 1,000 homeless people every night in the hostels. We've over 1,000 apartments all over Ireland, from Dundalk right down to Tipperary, where we can give a homeless person the key of the door and say, this is yours for the rest of your life. You never ever have to be homeless again. We have 5 drug and alcohol treatment centres. We have a lovely drop-in centre in the city centre in Dublin. And we actually run 2 small schools.
Oh my goodness.
We have 2 small schools, only about 40 pupils, but they're young people who have either been expelled from mainstream education or have simply dropped out. And the reason for that is that many of the people we work with have left school early. So we hope that by keeping these young people in school, and it is very successful, 95% stay, we hope to prevent some of them anyway becoming homeless adults in the future. Because if you drop out of school, you're hanging around all day, you're on the street, you're liable to get involved in a negative peer group, you're liable to get involved in drugs or in petty crime. And so we hope to divert them from that and therefore divert them from homelessness.
And do you get any government funding,
we
or
do.
is it okay? And is a lot of your work charity from the public as well?
As well. Last year we had a budget of about 54 million. We got 42 million from the government and we had to fundraise 12 million.
Okay.
And our explicit aim is to get about 2/3 of our funding from the government and 1/3 from fundraising. And the reason for that is if you're too dependent on government funding, it means you can't criticise them. And if you're too dependent on voluntary fundraising, it's insecure. So we like the combination. We think is the ideal.
And I wonder, would it make more sense if the government, as opposed to funding you, would actually put that money into housing? Like, how does that look? How can that be done? How can we?
Well, they already do put a lot of money into housing and into us. I mean, most of the money we get goes into housing.
Okay.
As I say, we have over 1,000 apartments now. We have we are projected to increase that by another 400 this year.
Okay.
So, and we depend on government funding for that because we don't have the money to build or renovate buildings.
And when you give someone the key to the apartment and say, that's your home, you'll never be homeless again, do they have to pay a rent, or is that's given to them and they know that they are secure in the knowledge that that is their home and they don't have to pay anything towards it?
No,
or how does it work?
They do pay a rent.
Yeah.
Many of them would be on social welfare.
Okay.
So a single person would get €200 in social welfare approximately.
Okay.
So they would pay us, say, €47 a week rent.
Okay.
The idea of that is to, you're not getting anything for nothing.
Okay.
And if you ever did want to move and go into private rented, you're going to have to get used to paying a rent anyway.
Okay.
So they do pay a rent. There's only one other condition, that you don't cause disturbance to the neighbours. And if you do cause a disturbance to the neighbours, we don't throw you out. We move you somewhere else.
Okay. So are these apartments then in other areas where people are living and working and they own their own homes? So it isn't just it isn't a block of apartments that's devoted for homeless people?
No, most of our stuff it's anonymous.
Okay.
So you might have a block with maybe, 30, 40 apartments in it. We might own one of them. And we put a homeless, so nobody knows they're homeless.
Okay.
We don't want a block to be, to have that stigma, that's where the homeless people live.
Yeah.
Because that generates opposition.
Of course.
So... No, we like to do scatter apartments right around the city. Okay. And that's much more successful.
Well, it makes more sense that people are mingling with everyone from all walks of life as well. How has homelessness changed since you opened your first hostel in 1979?
Well, that's very interesting because it's changed completely.
Yeah.
When we opened the first hostel, it was for teenage boys living on the street. There were no girls at that time. That came later. But we dealt with 12, 13, 14-year-olds who were living on the street. So I opened a hostel, went to the government, said, "You give us the money." They said, "No way. We don't agree with what you're doing. We don't see the point of what you're doing." These were kids who were living on the street. And of course, they were doing a bit of petty robbing in order to survive. So they were seen as delinquents who should just be locked up and punished. And here was me giving them a place to live, feeding them properly, buying them clothes, taking them on holidays. The authorities were outraged at what we were doing. So, and that continued for quite a while until the Child Care Act came in 1991. And that gave homeless children who are separated from their families, gave them rights, gave them a right to suitable accommodation and to care. And that changed everything. So you won't find an under 18 now living on the streets. They will be immediately supported by a social worker, brought to temporary accommodation, or eventually put into foster care or into a residential home. We run 4 of those for under 18s. So that was where we started. Then subsequently in the late 80s, drugs came into the scene. There were no drugs back then. In those days, my problem was the local off-licence selling cider to the kids.
Okay.
But then drugs came into the scene, and and with the Child Care Act, the under-18s were taken out. So the dominant problem then became young adults with an addiction. And that has continued and still continues to be a major problem. Then about maybe 9 years ago, family homelessness became the big issue. 10 years ago, there was no such thing as a family who was homeless. Yeah, families lost their accommodation or for whatever reason, but they were quickly rehoused. But come from about 2014, 2015, families becoming homeless with nowhere to go became a huge issue. An even greater issue than single people for 2 reasons. One, a single person who's homeless, right, you can open a hostel, you can give them a bed in a hostel, but you can't do that for a family. You've got to give them their own space. Plus, families with children, the effects of homelessness on children are well documented. It is extremely damaging to children. It's damaging to them emotionally, psychologically, educationally. They're stressed out. They see their parents stressed out. If you're stressed out, you can't go to school and concentrate, come home and do your homework. You may be living in a hotel bedroom, whole family living in one hotel bedroom. all your belongings in black bags, taking up all the space between the beds. So you've nowhere to walk around. Young babies can't even learn to walk because there's no space in the hotel bedroom to walk, and the hotel won't allow the kids to go out onto the corridor and play in case they're disturbing the others.
Now?
Yes.
Is this happening now?
Yes.
Jesus.
Yes. It's the damaging Focus Ireland have done several reports on the effect of homelessness on children, because Focus Ireland deal primarily with families with children, and the reports are devastating. It damages them. Now, children are very resilient. Many of them will survive, but some of them will end up in our hostels as homeless adults. Some of them will end up in addiction, and some of them will end up in prison, simply because they were homeless at those vital years.
It's the cycle that it's this cycle that needs to be broken, isn't it?
Well, we need to be able to house families. This is a vicious circle.
What caused the 2015? What caused the development of these families becoming homeless? Are they out of work? Or is there one person working, they just can't make ends meet? What is it that causes it?
Well, what happened then was that this country stopped building social housing. In 1975, this country built 8,900 council houses. In 1985, and we had a recession in the 80s, so we weren't flush with money, we still built 6,500 council houses. And in 2015, this country built 75 council houses. So when a family becomes homeless, there's no council housing to move into. And the reason for that is that for many, many years, the government tried to get the private rented sector to solve the problem of low-income families who needed housing. Previously, as I say, local authorities built lots of houses, managed them, but the government opted out of building council housing, pushed people into the private rented sector, made a big deal of it. I mean, it's embarrassing now to read Rebuilding Ireland, which was Simon Coveney, who was minister then. That was his solution to the housing homeless crisis. It's embarrassing now because he lauds the private rented sector. He says this is the way a developed economy should go, and we have to convince people of the benefits of a private rented sector. And now look at it's come home to roost. It's come home to roost. Yeah. And they were giving a grant, obviously, to low-income families to pay private landlords. And in the first year, is mostly called a HAP payment. In the first year, that cost about 400,000 to the state. Now we're paying private landlords €2 million every day to house low-income families. That's the subsidy that they're getting to give to landlords.
How do we claw back this? Why isn't this 2 million put into developing houses?
Well, you can't put it in. You can't put it in. We need to continue giving it now.
Yes.
In fairness to the current minister, and I'm supportive of the current minister, he has done a U-turn, and he is committed to providing 9,000 council houses every year. Not all built now. Some of them will be bought from the private rented sector, turnkey houses. But he's committed to providing 9,000 council houses every year. That's the direction we have to go in, to get the state back into taking responsibility for housing. My problem with the present minister is his targets are too low and the pace of delivery is too slow. But he's going in the right direction, and I will support him in that.
And do you think it's going to happen, this 9,000 figure? Like we're what? No. We're in May now. How many even built this year?
Well, no, it's not even built.
Okay.
A lot of it will be bought.
Okay.
Bought from the private sector. A lot of it will be money given to approved housing bodies like ourselves.
Okay.
To buy or build or renovate buildings. But if we could add 9,000 extra homes for low-income families every year, however they're provided, that is the beginning of solving the problem. But it's going to take years. There is no quick fix. I'd be very keen. There are a number of things I would love to see. Modular housing, modular housing is great. They're built to the highest standard. The insulation is fantastic. They have a lifespan of 60 years, which is longer than the Ballymun flat stood for.
It is actually, isn't it? Can you explain what modular housing is actually for people that don't know?
Modular housing is housing built on site and then transported and implanted in wherever it's going to be
like a
placed.
flat pack house almost, is it?
It's built. No, it's timber. Mostly timber.
Okay.
But it's built in a factory.
Yeah.
Then put on the back of a lorry, and it's brought to whatever site it's going to be on, and there it's connected up to the water and the electricity and the sewage.
Okay.
And the owner of one company in the north of Ireland told me he could build 600 of these every month. From starting to build one of these, he could have it in place in 13 weeks. Okay. Now, the obstacles are going to be planning and local opposition and all that. But I think modular housing is the short-term answer to is one of the short-term answers to the housing crisis. The other answer, of course, is the cost of housing is very high. Roughly a third, sometimes more, of the cost of a house is the cost of the land on which the house is built. There's a lot of land hoarding going on because land prices are going up every year. So people who own land are holding on to it in the hope that in 2 or 3 years' time, they'll get a bigger price for selling it. And there's a lot of land speculation going on.
Okay.
The Kenny report, which is now 50 years old, recommended that land for building should be compulsorily purchased by the local authority at agricultural value plus a 25% profit to the landowner. That would bring the price of housing down by over a third. In other words, a €450,000 house, if the Kenny report was introduced, that would bring the cost of that house down to about 300,000. And if you take out the development levies and all that the builders have to pay, and you use cooperative building societies which don't want a 20% profit, you could bring the cost of that house, 450,000 house, back down to about 250,000, make it far more affordable. People could move out of the private rented sector, could get a mortgage and buy their home. But that Kenny report has never even been discussed in government.
And I suppose, though, there's the other issue then that if someone owns land, so they're not going to want to give it up for a fixed price at a 25% profit if they could make a 50% profit.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of mentality. How could we even begin that conversation?
You legislate.
Okay. Yeah.
You say it's compulsory purchase. You can't sell this land. It's zoned for housing. You can't sell it to anybody except the state. So tough.
So they either have to sell it or just hold on to it?
No, if they can't hold on to it.
Okay, they have to
sell it.
It'll
be compulsory purchased.
Okay.
If they want to hold on to it, it will be compulsory purchased.
There'll be a lot of kickback.
Oh, there's everything to do with housing. There's a lot of kickback.
Yeah.
I mean, NIMBYism is alive and well everywhere you go.
Yeah.
Our preference for providing housing for homeless people is we rarely build houses from scratch. We like to renovate old derelict buildings or bring back into use derelict sites. And for 3 reasons. One, is cheaper and it's quicker than building from scratch. But the third reason is if you want to provide housing for homeless people in a community, the whole community's up in arms. If you're bringing a derelict building back into use, which is an eyesore and perhaps the focus of antisocial behaviour and drug taking, they're delighted to see that building coming back into use. So you get far less opposition from a community when you're trying to provide accommodation for homeless people that way.
But if you do that, then if you renovate a derelict building and apportion it for homeless people, are you doing what we said at the start isn't a great idea? You have a big building and lots of homeless people in it, and the finger pointing at that's the homeless building. No, are you talking about that this is...
We're talking about small developments.
Okay.
Maybe 4 or 6 flats.
Okay.
In apartments on a site.
Okay.
And the reality is that the fears of the local community around homeless people are largely imaginary. Mm-hmm. And they realise that, once it's up and running and people are there, what were we worried about? So we had a hostel going in another part of Dublin, I won't mention it. And it had been going for about 10 years. And so the locals in this area decided to ring the Gardaí, where the hostel was to find out what problems the hostel was causing so that they could use that to oppose the development. So they rang the local Gardaí, and the Gardaí said, we didn't even know there was a hostel in this area.
Goodness me.
So a lot of the fears are imaginary.
Well, I suppose people think
and
of
of course we will manage people,
Okay.
and we will manage them successfully. And if they do cause problems, and of course small number may cause problems, we move them somewhere else. And a lot of very few of the people we house cause problems, but a few do. But we have found that when we move them to a second place, another place, that works out very well, because they learn from the first experience that you can't go around annoying the neighbours, and they settle down in the second place. So, we never throw anybody out. That's a no-go. We are in the business of housing people and not putting them onto the streets. So we will never throw anybody out. We move them.
Okay.
So as I often said, if somebody comes into our hostel, one of our hostels drunk, and smashes all the windows, we move them to another hostel with fewer windows. we don't throw people out.
But I suppose people do have this thing in their head. They imagine homeless people to be addicts, participate in antisocial behaviour, to potentially be a danger to them and their children and their homes. So what is your typical, if there is a typical?
There isn't a typical, but we need to change that perception.
Okay. So let's
the
do that today.
majority of people becoming homeless today are being evicted from the private rented sector. Majority. Many of them are working. Many of them are involved in voluntary work in their local community prior to eviction. So we dealt with a young man. He had a part-time job, paying €900 a month to his rent. Landlord comes along, says the rent's gone up by 50%. It's gone up to 1,350. He had no way of paying that from his part-time wages. He gets evicted, and he ends up in our hostel. We dealt with a single father with 2 children. This would be quite typical. Wonderful man, wonderful children, never missed a month's rent in his life. Landlord comes along and says, I'm selling the house, you have to move out. Himself and his 2 children become homeless. So that's the new profile of homelessness. Why do the public think that homeless people have an addiction or a mental health? Because they're the only ones who are visible. They're the ones on the street you see begging. They're the one largely, not all, but largely. They're the ones you see sleeping rough. The others are invisible. That lad with the part-time job, he came to live in one of our hostels. Nobody knew he was homeless. His boss didn't know he was homeless. His part-time, his workers that he worked with didn't know he was homeless. Single father with 2 children, we were able to give him an apartment. Nobody knew he had been homeless. So most homelessness is invisible. But the majority of homeless people are invisible. It's the ones on the street who shape the perception that dominate the public imagination. But today, almost anybody can become homeless. You're renting accommodation. You're renting privately. All the landlord has to do is say, I'm selling up and you're homeless. You have a lot of students who are homeless. They can't find anywhere to stay. Some of them sleep in their cars if they're lucky enough to have a car in college. Some of them sleep in the common areas in the college. Almost anybody today can become homeless. If you're renting, for example, and you lose your job, or if you're couple renting and you split up, and one of them leaves, the other person isn't going to be able to pay the rent. So on their own. So today, almost anybody can become homeless.
Do you see it with mortgage defaulting as well? Do people that have a mortgage originally and they lose their jobs, can they also become homeless too? Are you seeing this?
Well, it's much more difficult. You have to go to the courts, and the courts are very reluctant to make people homeless.
Okay.
Now, they do it, but it can take years for a bank or a financial institution to actually obtain an eviction notice. And there are systems in place that somebody who's incapable of paying the mortgage for whatever reason can renegotiate the mortgage with a PIP, personal insolvency practitioner, or the mortgage to rent scheme. So much more difficult if you have a mortgage, but if you're renting privately, it's
okay.
And of course there is all those thousands of people in their 20s, 30s and 40s who are living involuntarily with their parents because they can't find anywhere to live at a price they can afford.
There's actual families living with their parents.
Yeah,
There's married couples with their children living with one or other of their families or their parents.
In overcrowded accommodation sometimes.
Which is stressful.
No privacy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, that brings upon its own issues. Can you just tell me about what it's like for someone who is living in one of your hostels? Do they have to leave in the morning and come back in the evening? Or
No, all our hostels are 24/7.
Okay.
You can come and go as you please. It's difficult though, it is difficult. And you put 20 or 30 people into a house, some of them may have a drug addiction, some of them may have mental health problems, some of them may have anger management problems. You put all those together into one house, you're asking for trouble. So it's difficult living in a hostel. You may be sharing a room with 2 or 3 others. You don't know who you're sharing with. Could change from night to night. It's very difficult. And particularly today with mental health problems on the increase, it's very difficult. So, one story, a young fella came to me. He was sharing a room. He was in bunk bed. He was in the bottom bunk, somebody on the top bunk with mental health problems. He was on his phone, lying on the bottom bunk. The fellow on the top bunk jumped down, said, "Are you talking to my girlfriend?" Smacked him in the face.
Okay.
Mental health problems.
Yeah.
You're trying to live with that. Somebody else was on the top bunk and the person on the bottom bunk had serious mental health problems, and he woke up at 2 or 3 in the morning to find the guy on the bottom bunk stabbing his mattress with a knife.
Oh, goodness
Hard
me.
to get back to sleep after that.
Yeah.
So hostels are no solution to homelessness. We want to end hostel accommodation as quickly as we can by providing long-term private independent accommodation for homeless people. That's our priority.
During COVID, they seemed to be able to make quick fixes overnight for homeless people. They were able to do it, and they were able to utilise funding and legislation to do so.
Well, a number of things happened during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
First, landlords couldn't throw people out. There was a ban on evictions. So there was very few new people becoming homeless into the system. And the second thing that happened was, there's an awful lot of Airbnbs advertised. Probably in every area you go, there are at least 10 or 20 times more Airbnbs advertised than there are private rented apartments advertised. So during COVID, there were no visitors, so the Airbnbs were lying there empty. So they came back into use. And in fact, we had landlords ringing us. We got more people into accommodation during COVID than ever before. So landlords were ringing us, and the others, Focus Ireland and so forth. But they were saying, "Look, I have this, do you have somebody that I could rent it to?" They knew we wouldn't put in somebody who's going to cause problems. So it was a win-win. The landlord got somebody in to pay the rent. We were able to place a homeless person in accommodation. And I think that's a large part of the reason why things improved during COVID. The other is that, and quite a number of hotels were leased by the health board, so that homeless people who were COVID plus or had been in contact with were able to be isolated in these hotels, and again that meant that the hostels were not as crowded as they would normally be.
And how many families at the minute are living in these hotels or the hotel rooms? Do you know?
There's about 3,500 children. I can't remember how many families that represents. Probably around the 1,800, 1,900 families.
Okay.
But I know there's about 3,500 children.
We were just talking about the pandemic and the way it was treated as an emergency, and you're saying the reasons why, the Airbnbs, etc. But do you think that the performance of the government with regards to housing completions and what would seem that it's not a very good performance, is it because homeless people don't vote? Is it because they're not seen as a priority?
You'd have to ask them that. I think people have negative attitudes towards homeless people, including decision makers. They share the perception that homeless people are drug users and mental health and their problems. I think the local authorities share that very often, so they don't want to be housing homeless people. They think this is going to be trouble. So I think it's partly the fact that there are very negative attitudes towards homeless people. But I am really disappointed at the response of government. You know, we had a foot and mouth disease in, I think it was 2001. Everybody came together, all the bodies, statutory bodies, voluntary bodies, they all came together. They devised a plan. There was meetings every week and everybody was asked, how are you doing with this plan? And we were able to solve the foot and mouth disease because everybody was working together. That's not happening with homelessness. People are still living in their own, working in their own silos. It's not happening. In Finland, they've solved homelessness in Finland.
How have they done that?
First of all, they just decided many people are homeless and they built enough apartments to house them. So they closed the hostels overnight and they put people into apartments. But there were two other factors that happened. One, the person who made the decisions stayed in the job for a long time, built up an expertise and a passion for solving the problem. Here, the Minister for Housing is responsible, but he's in the job for maybe 3-4 years. Then there's a reshuffle, there's an election, he's out, somebody else comes in, has to take 6-9 months to learn the job, and knows that he's not going to be there forever, so doesn't necessarily have much of a passion for it. So the turnover of decision makers makes it difficult. The other thing that they did in Finland was all the agencies worked together. Department of Housing, the mental health services, the addiction services, the social welfare services, they all came together to make sure that nobody falls between the cracks. Here, you can't get them to work together. It's almost impossible. There is a protocol that hospitals and prisons should not release people into homelessness. Happens every day. Every day of the week it's happening. So we're not working together. You get Department of Social Welfare, you're in one hostel, you're getting paid social welfare. You move to another hostel, you have to change your address, you have to make a new claim for social welfare. That can take 2 weeks. So you're left for at least a week without any welfare payments. It's they're just, nobody's working together.
And the recent announcement by the government to waive development levies to boost commercial viability for house builders, you know, that's fine if it makes housing schemes viable, but it's not very useful if it just boosts the profits for developers.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that part of the housing.
Okay.
My suspicion is it'll boost the profits of developers. I am very cynical about efforts that reduce the cost to developers. Will those costs be passed on? Some developers may very well pass them on, some may not. I just don't know.
Okay. And then with the new government maybe being in place in the next 2 years, you know, if Sinn Féin gets in, do you think that we'll see?
I don't think Sinn Féin will get in.
Okay.
I think they'll be the largest party, but they're going to need a coalition partner, I think.
Okay.
Now, who's going to go into coalition with Sinn Féin? Fine Gael have ruled it out. I think Fianna Fáil would be too embarrassed to be the junior partner in a coalition. Yeah. Okay. They would want to be the senior partner. The other Social Democrats, people for before profit, are too small, I think, to make much of a difference. Yeah. So I think Sinn Féin will be the largest party, but may have difficulty getting enough seats to form a... In fact, if you look at the Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil parties, they're on the polls, they come in at the same level of support as Sinn Féin on its own. So my fear is that there's going to be a repeat of the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael coalition with maybe some other party tagged along, maybe the Greens again. Okay.
And do you have any sympathy at all for like the accidental landlord? You know, do. Yeah, that's getting screwed, I suppose, for, you know, with their investment property and an inept government that can't deliver. Yeah. Adequate quantum of housing.
Yeah, I mean, landlords come in three sizes to me. There's terrific landlords who have a great social conscience, have a great concern for their tenants. I know one landlord who actually reduced the rent because he knew his tenants couldn't afford it. Then there are landlords who are struggling financially. If you bought during the Celtic Tiger years, you have a very high mortgage. You may be paying $1,600 a month for your mortgage. the rent on your property may be 1,600, but you're paying 50% of that at least back to the government in taxes. So you're only making about 800, so you're losing money every month.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of landlords in that situation, financially very distressed. And then there are the rogue landlords who don't give a damn. They're just interested in getting as much money as possible for doing as little work as possible. I've been in some rented accommodation which is unfit for human habitation. It's got huge problems, but the tenants in it can't complain because they're afraid if they complain, they'll be kicked out and they'll become homeless. So you have people living in appalling accommodation who are stuck there, who feel they can't do anything about it, and the landlord doesn't give a damn as long as they're paying the money. So I do have a lot of sympathy for landlords. I think the rent structure for landlords should be, I think they should be, their income should be taxed in the same way as income for a company, for example. It's taxed as personal income, so you pay the 40% or whatever it is, and plus the other taxes on top of that. So I would like to see the tax structure for accidental landlords. And more importantly even, if a landlord wants to get somebody out, they give them whatever amount of notice is appropriate depending on how long the tenant has been there. But in the end of the day, they're going to have to go to court to get an eviction order to get somebody out. And this is going to happen now with the huge number of people facing notices to quit. Many of them are not going to quit. They're just going to stay there. And there's nothing the landlord can do about it except to go to the district court, get an eviction order, and that's going to take 12 months. So landlords, I have always held that there should be a fast track process for landlords who are in financial or other difficulties, who have antisocial tenants or tenants who are not paying the rent. Fast track process whereby they can evict them from their own property. Without that, landlords are just scared to death, and they're scared to death now at people what's called overholding. The notice to quit has been given to them. They say, we're not going. There's nothing the landlord can do about it, except go to the district court for getting an eviction order. And as I say, that could take 12, 15 months. Meanwhile, the tenant isn't paying any rent. The tenant is having parties in the house or bringing in drug users to use the house as a drug den. There's nothing the landlord can do about it. So I have great sympathy for landlords.
So with this eviction ban lifting, though, is this what will happen? The eviction ban is lifted. So it means that tenants can be evicted if the
tenants can be given notice to quit.
Given notice to quit, but it will take 12 to 15 months.
Well, many of them will leave.
Okay.
After the notice to quit expires, many of them will. They maybe go back in with their families, or maybe they will register as homeless, or find some alternative accommodation for themselves. But some, I have no doubt, are going to overhold. They're going to say, look, I'm sorry, but we just don't anywhere to go, and we're not going to go out onto the street and live in a park or live in an hotel bedroom with 3 and 4 children. So I suspect some will overhold, and that's the landlord's ultimate nightmare.
Yeah. You were speaking there about awful conditions that people are living in because they're afraid. In actual fact, I was speaking with a lady recently who had moved from China and has a job here and has a work visa. And she said she's living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 6 other people. That's
rogue landlords. That is somebody who is just utterly greedy, who wants to make as much money as possible out of the misery of people. And I have no time for that. No time.
And are you seeing a lot of foreign nationals or a lot of even like Ukrainian people in difficulty now as well? Well,
we're seeing a lot of foreign nationals in difficulty. Yeah, about a third of the people who come near us would be foreign nationals. Yeah, there's a lot in difficulty.
And do they get looked after any less?
No. Well, once they have permission to stay in Ireland, they are in the same position as any Irish person.
Okay.
Now, if they're awaiting a decision, they're supposed to be in direct provision centres until the decision has been made that they can stay in Ireland. But there's about 5,000 international asylum seekers who have been given permission to stay in Ireland, who can't move out of the direct provision centres because they can't find anywhere to live.
And the direct provision centres, I think that's a podcast all on its own, and we'll get to that. But is there issues as well that you see where landlords are making unnecessary or like not nice demands of their tenants either? I've heard, and there's been programmes of women being expected to have sexual relationships with their landlord to pay the rent, etc. Do you ever come across anything like that?
Haven't come across that particular issue, though I've heard about it. But I have come across landlords who will, when the tenants go out, change the locks in the door, who will take up their belongings, put them in black bags and throw them out into the front garden. Or they will turn up with 3 or 4 heavies, make very threatening noises and tell the tenant to get out, and they have 24 hours to get out, all totally illegally. Well, I have come across those situations, yes, and a number of occasions.
Goodness me. The mental health services in Ireland, I think, are severely lacking. And I think that if we were to build up the country again and do it properly, we would start with mental health services from babies all the way up. Because what we see is we see children not getting the services that they deserve and that their parents deserve for their children. And these children end up in a cycle of drug abuse because they are self-medicating, petty crime, jail, ultimately homelessness, psychiatric issues for the rest of their lives. And I'm not being a generalist here, but a lot of it's male as well, I know that you deal with a lot of single males in your line of work as well, and with homelessness. Can we discuss a little bit about that and how you'd wave a magic wand if you had one?
Well, first we deal male and female. There's no distinction now anymore. We started with young boys because there were no girls in the streets back in the 70s. Well, we're now an equal opportunities.
You have to say that.
Yeah, it's a massive problem. We find it very difficult to get any adequate mental health treatment for people who are poor. If you have money, no problem. Yeah. But if you're poor, it's very hard to get suitable mental health treatment. And if you're poor and you have an addiction, if you have mental health and an addiction, what they call dual diagnosis, forget about it. You're not going to get help. The mental health services will say, well, your mental health, it has developed because of your addiction. Go and talk to the addiction people. The addiction people will say, well, you have an underlying mental health problem. Go and talk to the mental health people. Yeah. And you get passed from one to another. Very difficult to get treatment for dual diagnosis anywhere if you're poor.
Yeah, and then in terms of like support for families in situations where they are in hotel rooms, or support for the people that you see in your hostels, is there social worker support? Is there outreach centres that they can go to hang out in if they don't have jobs? Is there, I know we were talking about mental health services, but is there check-in centres for them, or is it very sporadic depending on where they are?
Well, in Dublin there are some. We have a drop-in centre. Now, because of child protection issues, we don't allow people under 18 to come in because we have adult males and females, some of whom can be problematic. Focus Ireland have a restaurant and Temple Bar that people can go to. If you have an addiction, Merchants Quay is the biggest addiction service provider in the country. So there are some places, and a Liffey project again in Abbey Street, and there are some places that you can go. Yeah, but it's not a great solution. People need something to do during the day. The hardest part of trying to stay off drugs is having nothing to do all day long. Yeah. Drives you back to drugs. Yeah. And you go into a drop-in centre like ours, you're going to have people in there who are on drugs, people who are using drugs. So again, we would discourage people who are drug-free from coming to our drop-in centre. It's not a good environment for them. So yeah, it's not.
There's no easy answer, sure there isn't.
Well, it's not easy for homeless people. It's not easy at all.
Do you think the government can deliver public housing at scale, or is the private sector essential as well? You know, developers like Michael O'Flynn, they've been very vocal saying that the public sector doesn't have a hope of delivering cost-effective housing at scale, and therefore private developers like him are the solution?
At the moment, probably true.
Okay.
Because with when COVID came, and when we stopped building social housing, and the state stopped building social housing, the local authorities lost all those skills. They lost their architects, they laid off their architects, their surveyors, and all the people who have skills at building, because the state wasn't building anymore and weren't giving the local authorities money to build. So now the state doesn't have the capacity to be able to build themselves the social housing that's needed. They depend now on the private developers to build for them.
Okay.
And they will contract with them to build. But as I say, private developers are interested in a 15 to 20% profit on their houses or apartments, pushes up the price. It is very difficult to buy or to build, say, cost rental properties or affordable housing without some sort of government subsidy.
And when the government decided to stop building social housing, was the reason behind that it's better that people strive towards paying for their own rent? Or it doesn't seem... Was it that, we don't want to become a welfare state? What was it?
It was an ideological decision.
Yeah.
The neoliberal decision is, government should reduce its involvement in the state. It should support private enterprise. The private sector can do things cheaper because they're more competitive. They can do things cheaper and more effectively than the public sector. And so there was this wave of privatization that took place. We've privatized almost everything. We've privatized childcare. We've privatised care of elderly in hospitals. 80% of the of the nursing homes for elderly people are private. We have largely privatised the health system because the public health system is so bad. So there was that movement towards privatising everything, and that included privatising housing. So it was a neoliberal approach. Government should get out of the business of providing services and let the private sector do it. And that has been an abject failure.
And could you see it getting as bad as it is in America here in Ireland? Because
No, we'll emigrate.
Okay.
I mean, I would ask the question, why would a young person with a qualification stay in Ireland? Yeah. They're never going to own a home. They're going to be paying astronomical rents for the rest of their lives. Cost of living here is one of the highest in Europe. Why wouldn't you go to Dubai or to Australia or to Canada if you have an employable skill and have a much better lifestyle? And that's already happening. The nurses, the doctors, the teachers, they're all going off to, many of them are going off.
Like they are saying two professionals can't buy a house in Dublin at a reasonable price, in the area near their family or whatever.
That's right.
And as a result, they're moving further and further.
Can't buy a house at any price.
Yeah. But even the stress of a commute that puts on a family as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the commuting. I mean, came into town this morning. I don't usually come in that early, but I came into town this morning at 8:00. I had to do something on the far side of the city. Then I had to get back to Ballymun where I live. I was 2 hours in the car. Yeah. I couldn't do that every day. Only I had to do it this morning and I was fuming. I couldn't do that every day. But some people are doing that every day.
I used to do it. I used to commute just because I was a relief pharmacist. I used to commute all over the city. And it's very stressful because it adds 2 hours onto your day. So I can't even understand what it's like for people that do it. And they've children to get home and get fed and collect from crash and all of that. You were saying that you have two little schools.
Yeah.
And they've a small... Are they DEIS schools or what are
they?
No,
no, but they're funded by the department.
Okay.
They're funded. They're schools for kids who have dropped out.
Okay.
Or who have walked out.
Are they secondary schools then?
They are.
Okay.
Yeah. We bring young people up to junior cert. Okay. Then we either get them back into mainstream education to do their leaving cert, or they go into youth reach, or they go into an apprenticeship. That's the ideal.
Okay. And how easy is it for someone to get out of homelessness? Now, I know there's different types of homelessness. There's homelessness where someone doesn't have a job, may have mental health and addiction issues, and then there's the family that you're talking about, or the professional that's lost their home because of a rental increase?
It's very difficult.
Okay.
And that's part of the problem for homeless people. And many of them have this sense of hopelessness.
Yeah.
They're never going to get out of homelessness. They're going to be in hostels for years and years and years. It's very difficult. It's a cliche to say, but it's so obvious. The solution to homelessness is to give people a home. And there's so few homes out there that homeless people can go into. So there is this growing sense of hopelessness amongst homeless people. And that's leading to frustration, despair, self-medication, self-harm. Yeah, it's...
So what needs to happen on a basic level to get, even you were talking about modular housing, and you're talking about the NIMBYism and the planning issues and that. Is there something that can be done?
There's no quick fix, and there's no single thing. Well, I would like to see, first of all, there's an awful lot. There's nearly 12,000 homeless people in hostels. Most of those hostels are shared accommodation. So you're sharing a room with 2 or 3 or 10 other people. I think if we're going to respect the dignity of homeless people, each homeless person should have their own room. Their own room, or at least their own lockable partition space where they can go to bed at night. They know they're not going to be assaulted. They know their property is going to be beside them in the morning when they wake up. And if somebody is a drug user and using drugs in the next door partition, it's not affecting them. And I think that would make a huge difference, because we have some hostels like that and people are very happy in them. They're very happy. It's the congregated settings that people are so unhappy with. Their property gets robbed. They can be assaulted. They don't know who they're going to be sharing a room with. So I think the first thing I would do is ensure that every homeless person who is homeless gets their own space to live in. At least that would give them a little bit of comfort, a little sense of security and privacy, which we all need.
Absolutely. And what would you say about, there's some people that might think that they've got themselves into that situation. They didn't work hard enough in school to get a good job, to, pay their rent. Why should the state pay for those people?
That's part of the neoliberal ideology.
Okay.
Yeah, the neoliberal ideology, those who have done well believe that they have earned it. They've worked hard, they've gone to school, often not appreciating that the situation they've come from, family which is financially secure, able to help them through education and so forth. I grew up in a home. My father was a doctor. We were financially very secure. I lived in a nice house in a nice area of town. I went to a fee-paying school. I went on to third level. I can't claim that for myself. That was given to me by the situation in which I found myself in. So I can't take any credit for the fact that I've turned out and I haven't robbed anybody or killed anybody. I can't take any credit for that. So I think this ideology that is very inherent in our mindsets is that, people who have done well, it's been their own efforts that they've done well. They deserve the rewards of doing well. And that is often true. But the opposite, those who haven't done well, it's their own fault. Oh. They have failed. They have dropped out of school. They haven't been interested in working hard. There's that judgmental. We've become very judgmental. That ideology, neoliberal ideology, makes us very judgmental. And so we look down on it, and that's why even decision makers would have very negative attitudes towards homeless people. When you listen to the stories of homeless people, I listen to most horrific stories of childhood abuse, children at 11 years of age being sent out into prostitution to make money for their alcoholic parents, children growing up in a home where the parents are using drugs. When you listen to those stories, you realise, the only difference between me as a priest and one of those homeless people who may end up in jail, the only difference is their start in life was a disaster and their path through life was a disaster. My start in life was fantastic and my path through life was very, very easy. That's the only difference.
I say that all the time to my children as well. And I'm not a very religious person, but I always say, but for the grace of God, go I. You are the person you are today because of the family that you're born into, the situation, the country you're born into. Like if I was a female born in a different country, I could have a very different outcome myself as well. So I think that compassion is so very important as well.
And the only way to burst that bubble is to engage with homeless people. You know, you can watch documentaries on prime time on RTE, you can read about it in the newspapers, but that's not going to change you. What changes you is actually getting to know some homeless people. And that's what happened to me when I went into the inner city of Dublin. You know, as I say, I grew up in a very comfortable space. I went into the inner city of Dublin with all my middle class prejudices, and I was shocked. And I was shocked by two things. I was shocked by the conditions that people lived in the inner city. The housing was awful. The unemployment rate was 80%. Young people felt they had no hope for the future. But what shocked me even more was that I had been living in Dublin for many years, and I had no idea that people lived in those conditions in the city centre in Dublin.
Because you're in a little bubble in your
we're all in
suburbia
a little bubble.
Or wherever you're living.
We're all in a bubble. And the only way to burst that bubble is to engage with people who are in a different bubble. So I say to people, you know, you go and talk to some homeless people. You know, when you pass them, just stop for a few minutes and talk to them. And if you see the same person sitting there day after day, go up and talk to them, get to know them a little bit. It'll change your mind. It'll change your attitude.
Do you know what? I'll tell you a story now, and it's just come into my head while you're talking there. So I had 2 encounters with 2 homeless people in the last month only. One of them was a male. I was in the car driving out of town to go somewhere, and he was going around with his cup, with begging at the traffic lights.
Yeah.
And anyway, I flagged him over, and I gave an amount of money, and he only said to me, he goes, "Are you sure?" As in, are you sure you're going to give me? It was €20.
Yeah,
it was nothing to me.
Yeah.
But he actually was shocked that he got,
right.
and then he went off and he picked up a sleeping bag that was in the corner wherever he was going to be catching for the day, and he was able to get up and go. And I just thought, oh my God. And the person that was in the car with me is a colleague of mine. She says, I can't believe he just actually said, are you actually sure you want to give that to me? And then another lady, I was in town again, I was doing a yoga class. The middle class woman that I am would go and do in town, be able to pay to go into a yoga class, and you feel, even saying it sounds terrible, but this lady came by and asked for a cup of tea, and I didn't have any cash on me, but I was going to get a coffee, and I said, do you want to hop into the car with me and we'll go and get a coffee? And she said, are you sure that you trust me? So they're not stupid, they know how they're perceived.
That's right.
So 2 people in the space of a couple of weeks both said, are you sure? As in they couldn't believe that someone would A, trust them, or B,
and generous to them. And
that to me, so we need to get out of this frame of mind that they're not the same as us. They absolutely are, and they know exactly how they're perceived in this world.
That's right.
And it's just so very sad to think
about
it.
There was a very interesting programme, it was a number of years ago now on television, where a reporter dressed up as a homeless person sat there begging, went around, I think, for the whole day or for a couple of days, and just the attitudes of people. Some people would pass by and just totally ignore them. Others might make very hurtful comments to them. Some people were very generous and kind to them, but it was a very interesting experience for the reporter. Often when I'm passing homeless people, I say, look, I'm sorry, I don't have any change on me. And the answer often is, well, that's okay, thanks. What's the thanks for? Thanks for not just having passed by and ignored them.
Yeah. So it's about seeing them. And
it's about acknowledging them. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I wanted to ask your thoughts on sustainability for the built environment, in particular embodied carbon. The Irish Green Building Council is saying that if we keep building the way we do at present, we're going to double our carbon budget instead of halving it by 2030. And we need to get to net zero by 2050 or 2030, and 2050 targets are legally binding. So what are your thoughts on that and the building houses?
Well, building with timber is far less carbon emitting. So I think the future is in timber housing.
Is there issues though with regulations and that, and timber and building regulations because of fires, etc.? Is there problems there with actually getting that across the line?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not sure, to be
Okay,
honest. I'm
okay,
not sure, but
okay.
I think timber is the way we're going. We should go. We should be building. We should be planting forests at a great rate, and many of the modular homes are timber built. I think that is the environmentally best way to go.
I'd agree with you there. Is there anything else that you'd like people to know about homelessness or about the work that you do or how they can help you with your work before I ask you my two burning questions?
Well, I would say, if you pass a homeless person on the street who's begging, say hello. I mean, it sounds stupid, but you're acknowledging them as a person. You're not just passing by and ignoring them. Second thing I'd say is, fundraising. We, as I say, had to raise 12 million last year. Focus Ireland had to raise even more. Simon Community have to fundraise. Everybody's fundraising because we have to keep our services going. So we're very grateful for any funding that we can get from whatever source. But having said that, fundraising will never solve homelessness. Fundraising will make the lives of some homeless people happier, more hopeful. But homelessness is a political problem and it has to be solved politically. What we want, we have a number of things we would like, but we would like that ban on evictions to be reintroduced and extended for several years so that we can reduce the number of people coming into homelessness. So, but with the proviso that landlords who are in difficulties because of the eviction ban could have a fast track process by which they could show their difficulties and get an exemption from the ban on evictions. So that's one. The other thing we would like is to see the right to housing into the Constitution. What difference would that make? Well, the right to education is in the Constitution. That means every young person in this country is entitled to an education. So they're not getting it, they can go to the courts. The courts will order the government to make sure this young person gets an education. Now, if we could get the right to housing into the Constitution, it doesn't mean at the day after the referendum passes, every homeless person can demand the keys of a house. Of course not. It's not practical. But it does give housing a priority in government policy over all other issues and pushes the government to provide policies and a timeline, maybe by 2030, at the end of which everybody in this country is entitled to a home that they can afford. So it's a political problem, has to be solved politically. And to anybody who asks, I would say, get on to your local TDs, get on to the Minister for Housing, get on to the Taoiseach, tell him you want the right to housing into the Constitution.
And can I ask you as well, actually, are there people that they're barely making the rent, and as a result then they can't feed their families?
Yeah, that's a common problem.
And how are they being looked after then?
One of the problems,
or?
Some of them are too proud to... Some of them were contributors to Vincent de Paul, are too proud now to be asking the Vincent de Paul for help. What's happened was that for 6 years, the HAP payment didn't go up. It stayed steady, but the rents were going up. So now a lot of people on the HAP payment have to pay what's called a top-up to the landlord to compensate for the gap between the HAP payment and the market rent. And that's something they can't afford. I'm working with a young fella, he's a single person, €200 a week, social welfare. Every month he has to pay a top up to the landlord of €125 out of his €200 rent. Another person, I don't know them personally, but I believe they have to pay a €300 top up to the landlord. And that's pushing people into poverty. So you could have a very good job, could have a very good salary, but you're paying exorbitant rent to the landlord. Some people paying 60-70% of their wages to a landlord and leaving themselves short of food and heating and clothing. And so it's the rental situation is pushing people into poverty.
And then one other thing I wanted to ask you about, you were saying about children's right to education, but with homelessness, are children ferried from pillar to post sometimes, which involves them having to change schools or involves them having to make unnecessary lengthy commutes to school?
Often the second one more frequently. Parents want to keep the children in the school that they're familiar with their friends, so they may have to make lengthy commutes. They may have to take two buses to get to school. You can imagine a parent who's working. A parent might have to get up at 5 or 6 in the morning, get the children breakfast, then bring one child to one school and two buses, bring the other child to the other school, try and get into work by 9 o'clock in the morning, and then repeat the whole process in the evening time. You never know where you're going to be housed. You're housed wherever there's a place to be housed. That can be a long way from your school, and you get used to maybe that long commute, but then in a few weeks' time you could be told you have to move somewhere else. You have to do the same thing all over again. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult. It puts huge stress on parents. And when the parents are stressed, the children know that, and they're stressed because the parents are stressed. I mean, one child said, look, every night my mother thinks I'm asleep, but I can hear her crying in the bathroom.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, it's awful, isn't it?
Terrible.
That's very sad. Okay, well, on that note, I would like to ask you 2 questions. What advice would you give young people today? And then what is the meaning of life?
2 simple questions, what?
They're very simple.
What advice would I give to young people today? First of all, I'd say stay in education. Every single homeless person that I deal with who left school early regrets it. And their advice, and we do have students who come and spend time with us, and the homeless people who talk to them, that's the advice they would give them. Stay in school. I really regretted dropping out of school early. I thought it was great at the time, but now I really regret it. So stay in school. And the second advice I would give is stay away from drugs. Their drugs are rampant. Cannabis, weed is a lot of people smoke weed. They're being told that weed is cannabis. Cannabis is harmless. Cannabis of 20 years ago was harmless because it was very weak. But the weed that is available today is very strong, and it's creating huge mental health problems. So young people growing up today are going to be offered drugs, whether it's cocaine if you're a middle class kid, or weed, or tablets. That's going to destroy your life. Stay away from drugs. It seems glamorous at the time, and it's enjoyable. That's what we adults sometimes forget. That it's enjoyable. These drugs are enjoyable. They make you feel good, but stay away from those. They're going to destroy your life. And what's the meaning of life? I know the meaning I want for my life is to be able to help other people. I don't see any future or any happiness in trying to build a life for myself, to be introverted, selfish, trying to get what I can. For me, the meaning of life is I want to be able to help people, and that gives meaning to my life. There's a little phrase, a little riddle. What is it? That the more you give it away, the more you have for yourself. The answer is happiness.
That's a lovely note to end on. Father Peter McVerry, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you.